Hello from Dublin in Ireland, where we're based. So I'm one of the founders of FenestraPro and COO, and myself and my co-founder Dave Palmer, we're both architects with more than 15 years experience in practice, a lot of it in respective specialisms. Dave in facade engineering and my own in advanced environmental design, and they're areas that we've lectured in extensively. But through our own practice and experience, we encountered and recognized an issue that most architectural practices face, whereby facade design is highly inefficient and almost circular in nature, driving a need to redesign the facade late in the process. So we set out on what's been, I suppose, quite an exciting and rewarding journey thus far to develop a software for architects to design energy efficient buildings to achieve the required performances and comply with relevant building regulations or codes without compromising the aesthetic design of the facade. So not only have we achieved that with FenestraPro Premium for Revit, but our innovative solution has allowed some of our existing customers and clients, which include some of the leading architectural firms in the world, to design attractive building facades quicker, easier and more cost effectively. I suppose it was crucial though to us as designers ourselves that as well as achieving those other important technical benefits, that we allow the architect to maintain control over the aesthetic throughout the design process and understand the implications of their design decisions from an early stage, rather than engaging in costly, inefficient late-stage redesign later on in the process, which are usually driven by third parties, mechanical engineers, cost consultants, for example, and they can often compromise the facade and elevational treatment of a building. So FenestraPro Premium allows users to deliver energy efficient buildings quicker and more cost effectively, and it's crucially operated within Revit, dynamically showing in real time the performance impact on the design and of the design on the performance. So this avoids the more typical time-consuming practice of exporting to a third-party external application. So this has a number of benefits. With a typical 30% saving in time, you can deliver projects much quicker for your client and cost-effectively for your own firm. By resolving and optimizing the building's performance early in the process, FenestraPro can eliminate significant redesign and reiterations later on in the project. It offers the architect the ability to maintain direction and control over the aesthetic design of the building. FenestraPro is very much focused towards designers and architects and giving the architect an understanding of the implication of their design decisions. And FenestraPro will give guidance around the compliance with building regulations such as ASHRAE 90.1, the IECC codes, for example, UK Part L, and dynamically feeds back results within Revit. You can also cut down the requirement for avoidable external consultancy on early stage engagement. So, all of these things add up for, like I said, a reduction in time and therefore cost to the architect. So if we had, say, a $165,000 design mandate, based on that 30% improvement on the design process, we're looking at about $50,000 saving. Our existing customers at the moment include the likes of Gensler, AECOM, Perkins & Will, Page Architects in Dallas, as well as a number over here in Ireland, where we're founded and are HQ'd, and in the UK, in London, including some of these firms, in London and in the UK. One of our earliest adopters were a really interesting firm, Adrian Smith and Gordon Gill, who you might know. Adrian Smith was ex-Skidmore, Owings Merrill, and they were the architects on the Burj in Dubai. Adrian Smith and Gordon Gill are currently the architects on the Jeddah Tower in Saudi Arabia, and which will be the tallest tower in the world in 2018, I think. And they were really instrumental in part of our development process and giving us very rich feedback and a dialogue with which we developed our product. So just before I jump into a demo in Revit, I just want to give you an outline, a bit of context in terms of what does FenestraPro do. So Revit was a natural home for us, or a natural starting point, in that we had a building information model with geometric properties, areas, volumes of the building, and such like. We have a site location and orientation, and then based on these inputs and these parameters, FenestraPro can allow the user to start implementing elemental and overall thermal performances for the different envelope elements at an early stage in the conceptual massing, or later in the detailed model of Revit, FenestraPro will read it from the properties of the families. So what we can do then is, based on the form factor of the building, or the relationship or ratio between the volume of the building and the surface areas of the envelope, FenestraPro can indicate the optimal wall-to-window ratio, first of all, for the building, and then how to optimally distribute that glazing around the building. So you can maximize your passive solar heat gains without overheating the building. However, as we know, these overheats may occur and probably will occur. So then it comes about how to manage them. So we have an outline glazing specification tool, or it will read the solar heat gain coefficient from the Revit family. We have optimized shading design tools. So all of these things will give the architect or the designer a very much a good understanding from an early stage in the process on the feasibility of their facade designs. All of these things will implement or will affect change on your daylighting performance within the spaces. So dynamically and real time, you can see if I add a shading device over the window, canopy device over the window to reduce my solar heat gains, what will that do to my daylighting performance? Or likewise, a frit. A frit can be a very effective way of reducing your heat gains, but it will also affect your daylight, for example. So all of these things give design and performance parameters in real time and very dynamically that allow the architect to understand the implication of their design decisions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through a very kind of brief demo whereby I look at three scenarios. One whereby we have a really outlined, simple conceptual mass whereby we have no wall-to-window ratio identified and we have no glazing resolution at all, no glazing applied to the building whatsoever. So, think of this as a very, very early stage. We're looking at forms and volumes. I have another scenario whereby we have a conceptual mass, we have a wall-to-window ratio identified, and we have some glazing applied to that mass that we're going to start looking at, and how do we check the feasibility or look at the effects on the passive solar design and the daylighting performance. And thirdly, I have a much more detailed model where we have curtain walling systems implemented. We have a wall-to-window ratio obviously identified, we have glazing resolved, we have glazing specifications by way of the Revit families, and we're going to look at changing those and how they will affect the performance of the building. So I'll jump into Revit now. And like I said, I'll just start with regards to the detail model. It's very outlined. Just to give you guys a quick sort of demo, a 3-story building, an office building or school, for example, where we have these glazing systems, these curtain walling systems applied, a number of detailed walls, roofs, etc. So FenestraPro Premium is an add-in to Revit. It sits up in the add-ins ribbon, like I said. And let's talk through the navigation first of all. So we have project manager, administrative aspects of the project, site location, address, project number, etc. Our building manager then gets a little bit more into the site itself, the actual building, the building use and the hours of use, or the use patterns or occupancy patterns of the building. So in other words, we could set it to be an office whereby our default patterns might be 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. or a school whereby university might be 7 p.m. to 10 p.m. Or obviously we can then change those patterns by the user can change them automatically. I'll leave it as office for the moment, so 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. throughout the year. And again, a school might be a good example of that. An office is used throughout the year. A school may be only in use between September and say June, whereby we'll eliminate the solar heat gains from those, let's call them, hottest months of the year in July and August. So that can make a big impact on the use of the building and the passive solar heat gains within the spaces. So our solar loads then, you'll start seeing start populating FenestraPro, and it's very much a visual, color-coded system. So whereby low levels of solar loads in blue, high levels in red, what we're not seeing here is somewhere in between in green, and you can sort of look at setting those benchmarks of those levels. Performance Manager is where we start looking at that wall-to-window ratio and the thermal performance aspects of the building, including compliance checking tools, iterate, IECC, UK Part L, for example, and I will come back to that in a minute. Our Facade Manager is where we start looking at implementing change on each individual facade or each individual surface. I will come back on that as well, because that's where we will change quite a lot between the conceptual masking tools and the detail model within Revit. Our outputs then, percentage glazing, a glazing distribution for each facade, our solar heat gains, our solar loads for each space and on each orientation, and again you see some of them in red, some of them blue, none of them in between in green. Our daylight and performance, which is average design daylight factor, an early stage metric. We haven't got into spatial daylight autonomy charts or anything like that. I think there's different products out there that will do that, and I can talk about a little bit more about different products and how we streamline into things like Revit and indeed Insight 360 by Autodesk as well, and a reporting tool whereby you can at any point export a PDF report. We also have an Excel snapshots tool, which I'll come back on later, so at any point you can do a snapshot which will draw down all the data into an Excel sheet to be looked at later. Let me go back to, let me open a different conceptual mass. So as I said, we're going to start with, this is one typical workflow. It's not the workflow, I suppose, because you can use FenestraPro at any stage from this conceptual mass right through to a much more detailed model. You can, come in and out using it at whatever stage you wish. But let me just kind of walk through to show you some of the features and functionality that we have. So I'll use this really simple conceptual mass, like I said, scenario 1, whereby we have no wall-to-window ratio set, we've no glazing set at all, and we'll look at this Performance Manager. So basically what I'm looking at here, in metric by the way, and I know a lot of you guys are probably imperial users, if this was an imperial model, of course we will see BTUs per square foot Fahrenheit, etc. here. But basically what we're looking at is FenestraPro's engine, which will start drawing the geometric data from the model and start looking at the form factor of the building. So like I mentioned, the form factor is basically the ratio between the volume of this building and the surface area of the envelope. And from that we'll derive a minimum overall performance. So it kind of makes sense logically if you think of a 40-story tower with a minimal footplate and roof plate, whereby the facade will have quite a high impact on the overall thermal performance of that building, because there will be quite a lot of facade, versus a single-story industrial unit the size of a football field, whereby the roof and floor plates will have a huge impact on the thermal performance and the facade not so much. So that's the kind of logic that we're using here. So that minimum overall performance value here is the entire envelope. When I start setting the thermal performance of my roof and floor, you'll see that my facade performance will change. In other words, if I have a poorly performing roof and ground floor, my facade performance has to improve accordingly. If I have a high performance roof and ground floor, my facade can loosen up somewhat. So let me leave these somewhere midway in between. And then likewise, as you start setting the thermal performance of your glazing and wall elements, you'll see that wall-to-window ratio or maximum allowable glazing change. So poorly performing glazing, I'm allowed, in inverted commas, use less of it. High performance glazing, I can use more glazing. And it's a kind of a logical approach, I suppose, with the glazing and the ground floor, or the glazing and the walls, and it's very much, let's think of another simpler scenario. I want a 100% glass box. How am I going to achieve that from a thermal point of view? And this is a very simple way of looking at that, So, so let me leave these somewhere in between, let's say 63% arbitrarily. You can play around with that, if this was part of your workflow and apply that. So I can apply that directly to the model and it will draw that to my conceptual mass. So that's the first part. Not typically the way we design buildings, but you know, it can be a very handy tool to start looking at the feasibility of buildings, and it can also be very handy when we start disabling certain facades and applying the amount of glazing that we have left on facades that, let's say, we're not so concerned over. Our compliance checking tool, I can set a number of building codes and start looking at how my building is going to achieve these. So based on the 63% glazing and based on some of the elemental values that I've input here, you can see there that if I choose UK Part L, some of these values are non-compliant with the selected standards and therefore they've gone red. If I improve the value of that roof or ground floor, you'll see it goes from red to black and now it complies with the selected standard. Or I could just set and it will jump accordingly to achieve all the compliance standards for all these different elements to achieve UK Part L. And that will go for ASHRAE, for IECC, and we're consistently adding. So at the moment we're putting in Title 24 and we're looking at the Passive House commercial standards. So then if I look at, I've applied 63% throughout the building, and that is reflected in my charts, and my solar loads then will also be reflected. So I will have, you know, quite high heat gains to certain facades, obviously to the south, a little bit lower to the north, for example, somewhere in between east and west, and then again, you know, the associated daylight values. So, you know, we have pretty good 9–10% design daylight factors here, which is a good starting point. So if I go back to these solar loads and I start looking at my facade manager, then one of the small features we can apply in FenestraPro is we can start looking at auto distribution of this glazing. So in other words, I have different heat gains throughout my building based on 63%, which has been equally distributed around the building. I could auto distribute that now. So what that will do is effectively equalize all my heat gains, except for a couple of these here where I've probably maxed out my glazing, but we've equalized all the heat gains throughout the building and we've redistributed elsewhere. So in other words, rather than have 63% everywhere, now I've distributed it accordingly, and again my daylight values will have updated accordingly. So before I start looking at then each facade individually, I'll go into my next scenario, which might be, you know, a 40% glazed building, whereby I have pre-populated curtain walling systems, let's call them, in a really notional sense. So I've applied 40% glazing, which, by the way, is probably, you know, my ASHRAE standards, for example, and I want to start looking at managing my passive solar heat gains to each of these and my daylight performance to each of these facades. So let me pop this out again. So you can see I have 80% on some facades. I've 32, 48, 0 on this particular facade, and I've again quite high heat gains to my south, for example, quite low to my north. What I could do at this stage is I can apply a typical type of glazing throughout the building. Wouldn't be unusual here to have one type of glazing that we'll use on every story, on every surface. And if I do that, that will change the values. So I'll just choose this quite arbitrarily, and you'll see my values will reduce from 80 whatever to 66 watts per square meter. My daylight performance has also been affected accordingly. But I'm not really too interested in that right now. I've kind of looked at that. Let me start looking at one individual facade. So you'll see here I've closed in here on facade number 3 to the west, which is where I have my high levels of heat gain. So some of these surfaces now have levels of heat gain. Some of them have 0 because these are opaque surfaces. So I'm looking at my overall facade, or I could drill down and look at individual surfaces. So how do I manage my heat gains? Well, there's 3 or 4 ways. First of all, I could reduce the amount of glazing on that particular facade or on that surface. I don't want to do that. I've a pretty much resolved design in terms of what I'm doing with my curtain walling systems. The next thing I could do is change the glazing specification. I'm going to start looking at that. And I can also add shading devices or a frit. So I can start looking at that. So first of all, let's start looking at my different types of glazing. So I have a solar heat gain coefficient of 0.62 here. Let me choose something slightly better. Actually, I can go to a triple glaze system, and you'll see that these are quite generic, arbitrary types. As we get into the more detailed model, you'll see them start to tighten up in terms of the manufacturer's details. So I'll apply that triple glazing system. You'll see my solar loads have reduced. My daylighting is also reduced. I can apply a shading device. So I can apply a shading canopy, and you'll see it starting to populate here. And as I drag my slider out or apply a dimensional characteristic there, it will reflect that on the model in real time. So I can recalculate that, and you'll see again I'm starting to get my heat gains down. So if I apply a frit, very high level transparency and coverage, so say 25% transparency over 50% of the glazing, and I'll recalculate that, and now my heat gains have gone into the green, let's just say. So they're a lot more manageable, a lot more occupant comfort, and a lot less cooling loads to be dealt with. So I could do that on an overall facade by facade level, or I could also drill down somewhat into individual facades. So say for example I have a retail unit, or a restaurant at this particular level, and I want a different type of glass, and I want 100% glazing, or whatever that may be. I could start setting that disassociated from the rest of the facade. So then what you're seeing here is my heat gains throughout the year, January to December. So I can very much see where my peaks and my low points are. And then the last thing I wanted to sort of outline is we can also, very handily, we can disable this facade. So when I'm happy with this, I can disable that. I can go to my next facade, say this one, I can disable that. I can go through a number of facades, disable them, disable, and then when I'm happy that I've got my key facades done correctly, I could then go back and do that auto distribution of glazing feature that I showed you before. And it's a good, effective way of sort of driving your design a little bit. So let me jump into the third scenario, which is the more detailed model. So now we have current walling systems with families, we have glazing panels with associated properties, and we need FenestraPro now to be able to read them. So I'll jump back into FenestraPro, and you'll see a lot of it is the same, and I think you've kind of got a little bit of I touched on it earlier. Everything will be the same with regards to our building manager, our performance manager, our facade manager is different though, because rather than that sort of high-level, broad stroke design stage stuff that I was looking at in the conceptual mass, we need something a little bit more detailed now in my detailed model. So we've built this Facade Navigator whereby you can group and filter through facades in a more meaningful manner. So rather than just choosing things by orientation, you could choose, well, I want everything to this southern facade and everything to this western facade, and I want to treat them all as one, and everything I change on that will affect both of those key facades. And that's fine, we can do that. Or we could choose both of those facades and start looking at the values, the inherent values. So for example, I've chosen this facade, this surface, which being this glazing, this curtain walling panel, and you'll see my values start to update here as well as my charts. So we've something a little bit more dynamic here. So now I have a thermal performance purely for this panel, this glazed assembly here. I have heat gain for this, just purely for this, the space behind this panel, and my daylight performance. And then obviously all the different elements and the different values and properties of that. So I have chosen that just via my Facade Navigator. I've chosen it, selecting facade number 9. I could also select by orientation. So rather than select facade number 9, I want to select everything to my west. So it will select that part, number 9, but it will also select my opaque elements that I looked at earlier and this curtain walling assembly over here. So now we have all of these elements throughout that whole orientation. And again, my my rounded up values for those spaces, let's just say. So I have chosen these, and this is reading the associated properties of this glazing and of these walling elements. So, oh, actually, before I do that, yeah. So we're looking at we looked at orientation there. We can also choose by story height. So I want everything to my first floor, for example. We can choose by the space, so I want everything to room number 1, or I want everything to the gym, you know. And as you group different ways, you can also filter different ways. So, you know, I want everything to all my facades to my gym, for example, but I want to, you know, eliminate anything that is less than 80% glazing. So, you know, there's different ways of navigating and different ways of working through the process. So, you know, we've called up this particular facade and this assembly, say, in this you know, in this part in our Facade Navigator. So, and we can see our values here. So then what happens when I start changing elements within Revit? So let me choose, for example, this glazed element, and I will go into my my properties, and I'll start editing some features or some properties in this. So I've got a really you know, quite poor domestic type of double glazing in this curtain walling system, and that's reflected, I suppose, by my high levels of heat gains. So in my analytical properties, in this particular curtain walling system, I'm going to choose something a little bit better. So let me just say go to something where we have, say, for example, not that one, let's say a triple glazed system with a 0.2. So I'll apply that, and you'll see again FenestraPro will update very quickly. First of all, showing our thermal performances and how that has improved, and then thereafter our heat gains and how that has improved. So we've gone from whatever it was, 50 something or 60 something watts per square meter down to 35 watts per square meter. Our daylighting again has reduced somewhat, but you can see how as you change and as you start applying properties to this, FenestraPro will indicate in real time what that kind of, you know, performance driven data will be within that space. There's other ways of doing it. That was just the analytical properties that I showed you there. If, for example, you have your family set up differently, whereby those properties are set up in a different way, FenestraPro will just merely ask you to map them to your preferred solar heat gain coefficient, or your visible light transmittance, for example, or thermal performance of the different elements. So that's that one particular facade. There's also nice kind of cool things you can do in Revit, whereby you can select these, you know, boundary styles and actually Gensler did something quite cool with the daylighting, for example, whereby they set up these legends and applied this, and they set up a number of isometric views of the model with different legends shown in the views. Well, okay, that one didn't work out very well, but, you know, different levels of daylight performance. So, you know, we're consistently improving our visual aspects of, you know, representing that data on the model and in our charts, and then in our Excel snapshots, which I will show you now in a second. So let me just choose a different facade, and I'll show you a couple of different features as well. I'm going to deselect that. So we've very much selected things via the Facade Navigator. Obviously, you know, as a Revit user, you're going to be quite used to obviously selecting things on the model, so of course that will work too. You can select, you know, directly from the model, and it will call up again all those different elements, including these punched windows. We've added something quite cool in these windows, whereby we can resize them directly from FenestraPro. So in other words, you know, again, very arbitrarily, let's just change that from 2 meters to 2.9 meters, you know, and again, you know, it's a FenestraPro family, for example, but they can be very good placeholders for future insertion of later families. So that was one just really simple way of changing your windows. But we're starting to add something quite cool whereby we're saying, well, what if you can do that, but make it very much performance driven or goal led based on the performance of your building. So I'm going to deselect this, and I'm going to select a number of other facades on my. I'm going to select, for example, this one, and I'm going to choose just 3 or 4 of these just to show. Oops. Okay, so I'm going to choose these 3 surfaces, which are representative of the spaces in behind them. And like I said, we're starting to add this. So this is very much an alpha stage. We're still in testing on this, and you can very much add punched windows based on the performance that you wish to achieve. So I could just input a geometric property, parameters based on width, height, sill levels, etc. Or in this case, what I want to do is insert it based on my heat gain. So that's our first step into this. We're adding daylighting, for example, next, and thereafter we'll start adding curtain walling systems, for example, and different shading devices. So based on oops, I seem to have lost it there. Okay, so like I said, alpha version, so you'll have to bear with me there. So okay, I guess I won't show you this then. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to show you was the snapshots feature, that at any point in FenestraPro, as you work through the process, you can create a snapshot based on all the inputs and outputs that you've been working through. So in this particular example, we're working on a school, and I've created an Excel sheet, and then thereafter, every time I hit the snapshots button, it will create a new option. So it's a sample school building in Boston based on these longitudes and latitudes, for example, these geometric properties, and I've created 3 different snapshots. Option A, I have one particular type of glazing that, on my glazing distribution, and I can see all my different surfaces across all the different months of the year, and I can see very visually what's overheating. Option B, I've changed the type of glazing. Option C, I've changed the type of glazing again. So, you can see, again, very visually, based on the colors and the formatting, what's overheating and when my peak loads are. But also, crucially, I have the data then to start, working in a different way or using to tell my own story. So we have that on all the different surfaces across the year, facade by facade, my heat gain per facade, my daylight and performance, and then in a really handy way, I have all my different surfaces drilled down into to give me the different area of the surfaces, the area of the glazing that's on that surface, and the glazing specification that we wish to use. So very quickly I have something that's quite high level for a cost consultant, for a mechanical engineer, for your own design team, for example, that you can use to start generating conversation or certainly further that design somewhat. So that kind of covers me off in terms of the high level stuff that I wished to cover. I did leave a bit of room for questions, so we've 20 minutes left. I don't want to keep you guys too much on your lunchtime and stuff, but happy to answer any questions if anyone has any. And actually, I'd like to, just before I do, just take the opportunity to thank Applied Software for hosting this. Amy and Blake in particular have been very professional in their approach to this, and so yeah, I'd like to thank you guys.
Thank you, Simon. And if you have a question, please type it in the pane, and we can answer that. Got a couple coming in here. First question, Simon. How much does it cost, getting right to it, how much does it cost and what is the licensing structure?
Good question. Have you taken back the screen there, Blake? Or no, it's okay, I can just talk through it. Yeah, so our licensing structure is network seats. So, because this is a facade design tool and it's very much, architecturally focused and base building focused. Let's be honest, you know, rather than that later stages in the design internally and, you know, and things like that. We wouldn't see it as being attached to every Revit license as such, but we have very much come at it from a network licensing point of view, so whereby you can put it on every Revit machine and thereafter have a number of seats that can be used. So if you take, say, for example, a 5-seat license, obviously 5 seats to be run concurrently within your office by whoever that may be. It's $1,800 per seat, and that would include all our, you know, updates, iterations, including the generative design part, which, okay, went a little bit askew on me. Of course, it always happens when it's at the wrong time. But if I can just talk a little bit more about that, we're taking some really good steps with that in conjunction with Autodesk, who we're working with quite closely on that. And it's something that we're really excited about. To, you know, the punched windows is only the first step on it. We want to start adding shading devices, you know, optimized to the performance that you require, and crucially curtain walling systems. So if to give you another example or scenario, if I want to achieve a certain level of daylighting within my space, what does that look like on the curtain walling system? You know, so with regards to the framing, with regards to glazing, with regards to the spandrel panel. So then as I start locking in parameters, if I say, well, I want my framing to be 1.5 meters wide, it will update very quickly to, you know, and update the model and show you very quickly, you know, what that looks like. So my point being, all of these iterations are all included in you know, in that annual subscription, basically. So $1,800 per seat.
Okay, we've got one more question. I'm not sure I understand it, but maybe you might. How does it know the surfaces?
It knows the surfaces basically predominantly through Revit. So they are generated through Revit, and that was one of the things that we had to try and, I suppose, deal with our new Facade Manager, because Revit can break up surfaces, and we very much leverage the energy model, and Revit can break up surfaces quite heavily sometimes. So we needed a way to quickly filter through that and quickly manage or navigate your way through that. So in other words, you can select all the surfaces to the ground floor, or all the surfaces to that particular space to the west. You know what I mean? So so I think we're finding in our sort of our existing customers and users who are constantly giving us feedback and dialogue, and that's one of the things we pride ourselves a lot on, is that we have a really close relationship to some of our key users, and we like to stay in touch with them, and we like to try and solve their problems, and we like to listen to them as to what they want to see happening, you know. So it's something that we feel that we're on the right track with regards to, yeah, navigation.
Okay, this was kind of along the same lines. What kind of support is available in case we have questions, issues with a model?
Yeah, we'll offer as, you know, as best support we can. We really do. We're not Autodesk. We're not a huge software company. We do like to have a good relationship with our customers, and we have a very one-to-one, and we have really good support, both through applied software as first line of support, and, you know, ourselves as a second line of support. So we don't like to see people having problems that aren't solved. So, you know, we do pride ourselves on jumping to it.
Okay, let's see this. I can see how this is used for new buildings, for instance, shells. Is this being used in a retail tenant finish out type setting?
Yeah, it is actually not retail, but certainly a restaurant as part of a larger building as well, whereby they were looking at daylight performance and certainly and definitely cooling loads, and it was quite advanced. It was quite an advanced design and quite an advanced schematic. You know, in terms of the detail to the glazing and stuff like that. So yeah, and we're consistently adding things and trying to change the way we approach different types of workflows, so different stages of projects. even things like existing buildings, you know, you're not going to have the same level of selection with regards to, you know, certain things that you can do. So we're tying things like that down. So yeah, I mean, as long as there's a window and there's a property to that window, you know, we like to be able to look at it and read it and analyze it and offer really good data on the fly dynamically to the user, you know.
Okay, I've got maybe the last question here. What are your development plans over the next 12 months and beyond?
Very much based on the generative design piece. It's something we're really excited about, and like I said, we're working quite closely with the building performance analysis group within Autodesk on that. You know, we are very much a Revit tool, and we do complement, I suppose, is the best word I can think of. Complement, obviously Revit, but also Inside 360, and you know we're working quite closely with those guys about how to complement them. So yeah, it would be, if I could give a really short answer, the generative design aspects whereby we can generate on the fly performance-led facade designs. Our user interface we're updating at the moment, and we're polishing up with regards to how we demonstrate, or how we get across a lot of that data, and just generally, you know, improving our performance. That would be our key goals for the next 6 to 9 months, and thereafter we'll you know, we're consistently talking to our users and our existing clients and as to what they would like to see, you know.